all, and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and a Take 5 for Florida History. I've been asked to give a short history of Florida tourism. Obviously, this subject would fill a rather large book, but this will be just an overview which hopefully will be able to give you a sense of its development and a few of its defining moments. I generally divide the chronology of Florida tourism into 5 eras, which are listed here. The 1870s to 1919, Florida's first steps into tourism. 1920 to 1945, Florida's discovery by the average American. 1946 to 1959, Florida's golden age of tourism. 1960 to 1971, Florida's tourism comes of age. 1971 to the present, Florida's big park tourism. While there were intrepid travelers to Florida before the Civil War, that horrible part of American history provides a good start for our story. Yes, steamboats had already been carrying travelers on the St. Johns River between Jacksonville and points to the south, but it was the 3 Seminole Wars which retarded Florida's development between 1816 and 1858. The Civil War lasted between 1861 and 65, and it's then that Florida began developing as a vacation destination. At first, and for the most part, it was the wealthy who discovered that Florida was a great place to spend the winter season. Florida's first construction boom created the opulence they expected out of the sand and swamp. Steamships docked in Jacksonville, and high-quality rail lines replaced a fractured system of local lines that mostly provided transportation for the post-war agricultural boom. Florida's most famous Henrys, Flagler and Plant, developed the railroads, depots, and hotels that drew representatives of the country's Gilded Age. They spared no expense, because for these winter resorts to compete with the summer resorts in New England, they needed to be as extravagant as anyone could dream. For the most part, the destination wasn't important as long as it was temperate and the visitors were provided for their every need. If you think that today's theme park visitors act entitled, you should have seen how the wealthiest Americans lived during their winter seasons. In the beginning, St. Augustine, Palm Beach, Miami, and Tampa were the primary destinations of the wealthy. St. Augustine was unique in that the nation's oldest city had been a destination long before Henry Flagler first visited it in the 1890s. The town was picturesque with old Spanish architecture, some in ruins, some not, and quaint street scenes. The other places mostly grew based on their development as winter vacation destinations. It was the tourist market that gave each of them an initial boost to grow from quiet village to the huge cities they are today. Other places in Florida were starting to create what would grow into significant attractions at the same time. Silver Springs became a destination for travelers who went by riverboat on the St. Johns from Jacksonville south to Enterprise and Sanford on Lake Monroe. The democratizing effect of the railroad allowed the growing number of American middle class to begin to explore places as well. These were fearless travelers, however, as there were few facilities designed for their use. Florida slowly developed into a tourism destination for the country, though most of the attractions born during the time were originally designed with locals in mind. Florida's first steps towards land conservation and historical preservation also began with the creation of its national forests, state parks, museums, and zoos. The years between the wars saw a general expansion in every area of Florida tourism. The early post-war boom gave a sense of optimism that arrived with the beginnings of actual tourism industry that didn't just focus on the rich. This was a time when mom-and-pop attractions began to develop in earnest as the early tin can tourists motored into the state, staying in some of the country's first trailer parks and motels. The tin can trailer parks didn't have much in the way of amenities. There wasn't electric hookups, and water would typically come from a communal well. These hardy tourists were nearly entirely self-sufficient. Little published information is available about the Florida attractions of the 1920s because most of their advertising budgets were spent on billboards and making the attraction's facade irresistible to passing motorists. Some families headed to the Sunshine State with only expectations of seeing beaches, alligators, and oranges. The rest they discovered as they traveled. This was the era of the beginning of the highway systems. It began with the Dixie Highway, which you can learn more about in this video. The new systems provided better quality road surfaces as well as businesses that catered to the tourists, and through national promotions they encouraged Florida tourism. Probably the biggest event of the era was the creation of Edward Bach's Garden and Singing Tower. An immigrant from the Netherlands, Bach hired a nationally recognized landscape designer and a northern architect to make an attraction for the masses that was equal to any in the U.S. While the millionaire Bach was doing great things in the center of the state, another immigrant, Edward, the Latvian Edward Linskallen, quietly began to construct his own remarkable monument south of Miami. Florida was still a quiet place with the smallest population of any state in the South, but its reputation as a vacation destination was growing. The era would end with World War II turning everything upside down once again. The irony is that while the tourism industry halted much of its operations during the war, Florida's reputation as a vacation paradise grew like never before. From 1941 to 1945, Florida became seemingly one giant military installation. Some 1.2 million acres of land were used by the military, hotels and hospitals were converted into service personnel facilities, and about 200 military installations were created or expanded. Millions of Americans, many of which had never been to Florida before, passed through the state in the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, or as civilian workers to support military camp work and industry. Those personnel were the ones who visited Florida attractions, parks, and beaches during the war. Unnecessary driving was prohibited, so many natives couldn't go to Silver Springs, Cypress Gardens, or even the beach unless they lived close. Dick Pope of Cypress Gardens used to say that they developed their water ski shows for the personnel at the local bases. Major resort hotels along both coasts were converted to military housing. The roads and rail lines were also improved. All this set up Florida for a tourist boom immediately after the war. Florida actively promoted itself as post-war paradise, and millions came, settled down, and bought homes. Many more came to visit the land of sunshine, citrus, and bathing beauties, some on the very first family vacations of their lives. Many of what are now the classic roadside attractions appeared at this time. Developers saw the numbers of tourists coming to the state and came up with as many creative ways as possible to draw the crowds. Weeki Wachee had mermaids. Caribbean Gardens had duck vaudeville. The Circus Hall of Fame had clowns. Potters had wax figures imported from London. The Great Masterpiece had a giant recreation of a great masterpiece. And Ripley's had, well, what they proudly called oddities. There were more alligator farms, aquariums, and zoos filled with exotic animals from around the world. Miami's beaches were rapidly developing into one of the world's top resorts, and Daytona Beach was establishing itself as the center of stock car racing. Times were great for Florida and tourism. Every major road leading from the rest of the country into and around Florida had places to entertain the masses. Even though the number of visitors to Florida continued to increase in the 1960s and the economy stayed strong, Florida's golden age of tourism began to fade away. It's an oversimplification, but the cause of the slow decline of most of Florida's tourist attractions was the establishment of the Interstate highway system and Florida's Turnpike. Starting in 1958 with the construction of the first parts of Interstate 4, by 1970, most of the primary highways were complete. Interstate 75 and 95 funneled motorists quickly and efficiently into the state and to the large cities, such as Jacksonville, Tampa, and Miami. The old roads that carried the original tin can tourists were suddenly obsolete. Yet these were the very roads that many attractions were on. Major attractions such as Cypress Gardens, Silver Springs, Weeki Wachee, and Wakulla Springs found themselves miles away from the majority of travelers. This was a time of increasing advertising budgets, attractions being purchased by much larger companies, and a decline in attendance at many classic attractions. To survive, the owners had to adjust and adapt. Rides were added. Nearby attractions banded together. New and different shows and activities were offered. Still, other attractions were doing well, and new ones were even opening. In actuality, this wasn't exactly a bad time for Florida tourism. Really, there hasn't been an extended period in Florida history where the tourism industry as a whole was affected significantly, other than during the Great Depression. In many cases, attractions had to learn that simply putting out a sign on the road was no longer enough to make money. Most did adapt and survived. Any history of Florida could contain the sentence, "And then Disney came and everything changed." In the mid-1960s, at the very time many Florida attractions were struggling to entice tourists off the interstates and Turnpike, the creator of Disneyland, Walt Disney, quietly visited Central Florida and picked property close to two of the modern highways. Uncle Walt planned to double down on the runaway success that was Disneyland. What happened was a radical change for tourist attractions and the economy of the state. Only World War II and its military mobilization could be said to change Florida at the same level in such a short time. In 2018, 52 million people visited Walt Disney World, the #1 tourist destination in the world. And like so many attraction developers during Florida's Golden Age, new development rushed in to create a second Golden Age. Where prior to 1971, there were no modern-day themed attractions in Central Florida, 3 years later there were 4. 30 years later there were 9, each with its own themed lands, state-of-the-art rides, exciting shows, and millions of visitors from around the world. Florida's tourism past was struggling, however. Many of the attractions from the first half of the century failed to continue to be successful. Some trimmed back to save costs, some were turned into parks owned by the state or a local municipality, while others quietly closed their doors forever. Not all was lost, however. While the state of tourism is radically different today than 50 years ago, the creative traveler can still find old Florida. There are many wild areas still to be visited, as well as many glimpses of the roadside attractions that made Florida famous long before Disney. Some of Florida's state parks still hold on to the old ways, especially Weeki Wachee and Homosassa. While St. Augustine has newer attractions, the historic Castillo, Oldest House, Lightner Museum, and Alligator Farm are still strong links to Florida's tourism past. Numerous botanical gardens continue to operate with strong community support, such as Sarasota Jungle Gardens, McKee Gardens in Vero Beach, and of course, Bach Tower Gardens. While it's a shame more tourists don't escape the Disney World net, this means that the early attractions are more accessible to travelers who care to see more of the Sunshine State, including its natural beauty and fascinating history. It appears that little will change as time passes. The major theme parks have evolved and continue to adapt to advancing technology, both as ways to entertain as well as ways to manage the sheer number of visitors that would have been unimaginable 40 years ago. With the internet, smaller attractions have a voice that can speak to anyone planning a Florida vacation. Just 25 years ago, many attractions only relied on word of mouth and the colorful brochures visitors could pick up at one of Florida's welcome centers or highway rest stops. This has helped the old attractions that are still operating to continue to be economically viable businesses in the highly competitive industry. Thank you for watching another of my videos. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more information on Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.